Hello, everyone. I see people are joining. Please come on in. We'll wait a minute or two so that we can so that everybody can log in and get their audio going. Okay, we'll get started in just one more minute. All right, great. So hello, everyone. Welcome to From Blueprints to Breaking Ground, Capital Planning for Health Center Growth. This is our third and final session in our three-part series. And today we will be talking about project implementations and lessons learned. Next slide. Okay, so in our first session, we spoke about goal setting and project planning. That happened back in October. Then in November, we talked about capital sourcing. And today we are wrapping up our series by talking about project implementation and some lessons learned. And we have some guest speakers to join us today to tell us about their actual experiences. Next slide. So we are coming to you from Primary Care Development Corporation, where for the last 30 years, we have been providing financing, consulting, and advocacy to enhance access to primary care in the communities that need it most. Today, we are going to be talking about some of our financing work, but please don't hesitate to reach out if you want to learn more about our consulting and training and our advocacy work. Next slide. So in the last 30 years, we have had a significant impact on primary care practices in their communities, and we have leveraged over $1.7 billion in low-income communities, and that is providing loans and expertise to many of you in your health centers. We have also worked with over 1,300 practices to transform them into patient-centered medical homes, and we continue to strive to create jobs and really train our health workers so that they can have the best experience and have the greatest impact on their patients. Next slide. So today, our core team of presenters is myself, Maya Morse. I'm a director in the Consulting and Training Division at PCDC. We also have Rachel House. She is a senior program manager for the Consulting and Training team, and Nancy Lager, who is a senior director within our capital investment team. All right, now I will pass it along to Rachel House.
Thank you, Maya. So today for our agenda, first we will do a brief recap of the first two sessions where we covered project planning and capital sourcing. Next, we will discuss the final two phases in the capital project planning process, which includes the project design and construction and closing. So we'll review the stages of project design, as well as look at the timeline for design and construction, and some key decisions as decision points, including who and when those decisions occur. And finally, we will have a panel discussion with our guests who will provide some real world experience from working on a capital project. So that will be a very interesting part. So we look forward to that. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to do just a very quick poll so we can get a sense and our panelists can get a sense of where your organization is in the process. So if you're kind of in the early phases of planning, strategic planning, or if you have a project underway, or maybe you're not planning a project at the moment. So we'll give you a minute to complete the poll. Okay. So looks like we have a pretty good mix here. About 30% are in the project planning or strategic. We have 15% in strategic planning. So about half of you are in that planning phase. About 15% have a project underway. A few have recently completed a project, and then we have about 30% who have not started a project. So that's helpful, and we're happy you're here to be a part of this discussion. Okay, next slide. So again, for those of us that have joined for the other two sessions, you've seen this. These are the key steps of planning a capital project. The first three steps, the strategic planning and pre-project analysis, and the project planning we covered in the first session. Then there's the project funding, and today we will focus on the project design and closing and construction phase. Next slide. Okay, so during the first session, we spoke about conducting a pre-project analysis, and this is really a critical step that often can be overlooked, and it's important to understand why you are pursuing a capital project and what need or problem you're looking to solve. So this includes doing some strategic planning to identify your organization's short, medium, and long-term goals. And specifically, it's important to identify if the organization is anticipating growth or increased demand for patient care or perhaps additional services that you are not able to accommodate within your existing resources. We encourage organizations to conduct external community needs assessment to inform their planning process. This is a requirement of HRSA every 3 years. And it's helpful to understand if there are unmet needs or services in your community. We also encourage you to perform an internal assessment. So this includes an operational assessment of productivity, staffing, financial health, and access to care metrics. And so this will help you determine your operational performance and if there are improvements that can be made prior to pursuing a project, and also if you're unable to accommodate current or future demand. It's also a great idea to consider all options for growth, including possibly expanding hours or using moonlight providers, as well as expansion, relocation, or acquisition of another practice. Within project planning, so once you've made the decision to pursue a capital project, we suggest organizations develop a work plan and identify their internal and external project team. So these are the people that are really going to be managing the project and ensuring that it moves forward. And this team will need to clearly outline a project and space plan and develop an initial budget. So finally, once you have clarity around your project plan and have that initial budget, you will then need to consider how you will pay for your project. So this includes reviewing available funding sources, which include cash, which could be capital reserves that your organization may have, as well as fundraising and grants. And then depending on the size of your budget, you may also need to consider debt or taking out a loan to obtain the remaining funding needed. So in our last session, Nancy walked us through how to perform a debt capacity analysis, which includes a calculation of how much the organization can borrow. And that's based on historical performance as well as other sources of funding that you may have available. And then finally, you'll start raising funds for your project. So with that, we can move to the next slide and I will pass it on to Nancy to talk us through the next phases.
Thank you, Rachel. So shown here, even though there's some overlap here in the presentation with the prior two presentations, but we'll try and cover that quickly. But I think this is the first time we've shown what a capital project timeline might be. These are the four main phases of any facility development project. And we'll talk about the construction and design and construction phases on the next slides, but really want to talk about just timing here and say most projects we've been involved with have taken from 1 to 3 years to complete these four phases. The key aspects that contribute to this variability are the organization's, your own ability to carve out time to focus on developing the project, the ease of locating and securing a site, the potential difficulty of pulling together the funding you need, and obtaining the needed approvals. So, and sometimes there are hurdles you couldn't have anticipated. For example, one sort of extreme version is we worked with a health center who experienced a particularly egregious hurdle, which was that after they'd completed their leasehold improvements, the State Department of Health required them to construct a new exit stairway through another tenant's space, which ended up delaying the center's opening by more than a year. That's extreme, but again, something unanticipated. Next slide, please. So the four real phases of the design process. In that pre-schematic design, that's really covering some of those pre-project planning elements that Rachel described. But the overall design phase is really where you obviously design, define, and refine what you plan to build. And as I mentioned in prior sessions, flexibility is one of those elements you need to keep in mind. That and affordability. And as I also said, the sustainability of your organization. So keeping those in mind, you may or may not be able to do everything you want. You may have to find alternative ways to meet your goals, potentially by phasing your project if your goals outstrip your funding capabilities. So just something to go into the design process knowing and being aware that you may need to not follow the straight line you had hoped to follow. So very quickly, in project planning in the pre-schematic design stage, this is when you do work with a space planner or an architect, preferably, to identify all the kinds of spaces that will be needed to house the clinical, administrative, and whatever community services you want to put in your proposed facility. The planner will also work with management to determine how many of each kind of space is needed. For example, how many medical exam rooms and dental operatories, and how large each type of space should be based on how you plan to use the space, how you'll equip it, and whatever minimums may be needed to meet building and other regulatory requirements. The space plan is also used to determine how large overall a facility is needed in terms of square footage. In the schematic design phase, all of the spaces will be laid out by an architect within the existing or proposed building confines. I say existing because maybe you are purchasing a building or intend to occupy a building that already exists, and the proposed is you're going to build a new facility, and there are constraints as to what you can build on the site. So laying them out, though, is also based on your organization's desired patient flow and service delivery parameters. The number and kind of spaces may also vary based on the number of floors that you will have in the facility. For example, in a one-story building, there's no need for an elevator. And in a very large facility, you may want to consider sub-waiting rooms rather than just having one central waiting area. So a lot of decisions to be made. The products of this stage, the schematic design stage, are a floor plan with simple furniture and equipment layouts, and importantly, an updated budget estimate. That is something you should do at each stage. And part of it is there is more and more detail that is being provided and refined at each stage. And so it is a chance to become more and more specific with that budget estimate. So in terms of design development, this is when the equipment and furniture are really specified. The design is refined, based on those specifications, as well as on the kinds of mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems that will serve the facility. The products of this stage are that specific equipment and furniture plan, more detailed design documents than have been produced previously, and an updated budget. Then finally, in the construction document phase, that's when the documents are, again, further refined and specifications are written, both of which will guide the contractor. The products of this stage are those documents that will be used to bid the construction to a contractor and submit to any regulatory agencies that must approve the plans and issue building permits. You may find that based on the contractor's bids, the design may need to be adjusted to ensure the project remains affordable and fundable. Again, that's where flexibility comes in. Next slide, please. So just in terms of the construction and closing process, by closing, we really are referring to the financing. So if you're able to construct or develop your facility, your project entirely with cash, which, as Rachel said, may include grants or your own reserves, then there won't be a closing. But if you need financing, there is a closing that comes between bidding the project to contractors and starting construction. As you'll then also hear from our panelists, you can't just put your feet up and watch everyone else work during construction. It is still, the owner is still incredibly involved during that period. And there are many decisions that will be made during that stage. And some rethinking may need to happen based on what may be discovered about the site or the building if there is an existing one, what we call unforeseen field conditions. Okay, next slide, please. So this is detailed. I'm not going to go through it in detail. It's really there as a guide to the main decisions that organizations need to make during each phase of a project's development. For those of you who attended the prior two sessions, you'll recognize a number of things we touched on when we discussed planning. For example, setting that initial project budget. And then during each phase, you'll see that the budget continues to get refined and become more detailed. Prior to construction, the focus is on the development of the project, whereas during construction, the focus expands to include the planning for the startup of operations. That's where you start working on recruitment and training of new staff, new policy setting, and when the organization is moving from an existing center to a new location, you start planning for and communicating with patients and staff about that move. Next slide, please. In this slide, we've identified the advisors you may need to engage, such as the architect, and those you may choose to engage to supplement your in-house expertise. For example, engaging a project manager. We know that few organizations have on staff people who are well-versed in all aspects of capital project development. And everyone, actually, every organization can benefit by having someone who can advise the organization directly, herd all the cats, and knows how to anticipate decisions needed and solve problems. It is been clear to us from our experience, owners can waste a lot of time and money by not actually being in a position to differentiate a good decision from a bad decision. That's where having these advisors is really helpful. We have also on this slide identified when it's the best stage for bringing on each advisor. I can't stress enough, it pays to get the best help you can afford and to engage consultants as early in the appropriate stage as possible to help you really move your project forward in the most enlightened fashion, shall we say. Next slide, please. This slide is meant to be really a cautionary slide. So in each successive stage, it becomes more expensive to make changes, hence the bigger dollar sign as you move forward. So it's really best if you can think through as much as possible, spend the time in the planning and schematic design phases to understand and plan for what you want to accomplish, and to be realistic about what you can offer at the site and what you can afford. It becomes more costly in terms of both time and money to rethink earlier decisions or add scope in the later phases. It doesn't mean you won't need to make some changes, even in the later stages, to stay within budget. But those hopefully will be subtractions and not additions to the project. And I'm hoping our panelists will touch on that as well. Next slide, please. So I think for those of you who've been through a project, you know very much that this is not, project development is not a linear process. It is iterative. And that's why we even say at each stage, you're going to relook at, re-examine the budget and refine things so that you can move to the next phase better off. So while the goal of the prior slide was to minimize changes as development progresses, I do want to say refinements are natural. So that may sound counterintuitive or countermanding each other, but it does happen that you need to make changes. But again, we're talking about not just changing your mind about things. That's a costly change. Not understanding you might need to scale back on something because you just can't afford it. So next slide, and I think I'm turning this back to Rachel.
Yes, thank you, Nancy. So before we transition to our panel discussion, we just want to briefly mention how PCDC can help and support you during this process. So our consulting team, which Maya and I are on, we can help particularly in the pre-project or planning phase as you're considering your project. We can help with things such as KPI analysis and benchmarking, financial modeling and budgeting, revenue cycle management and optimization, access and capacity planning, and care model optimization. So important considerations in the early phases and as you're considering embarking on a project. And then of course on our capital investment team, which Nancy is a part of, can help with questions such as analyzing your debt capacity, reviewing financing options, and providing financing as necessary. And so we have lots of resources to help. We've done this many times, so we're happy if you want to reach out if you have any questions. Next slide. Okay, great. So now we're going to transition to our panel discussion, which I'm very excited for. I will introduce our panelists, and then they will each have an opportunity to introduce their organization and tell us about their project before we launch into the discussion. And just as a note, we will be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions as they are talking, we encourage you to drop those questions in the chat and we'll try to bring them up in the discussion. So first, I want to introduce Philip Onorato. He is the CEO of Brooklyn Plaza Medical Center in Brooklyn, New York. He is an attorney and served as outside counsel to BPMC for over 25 years. Mr. Onorato has extensive experience working in nonprofit healthcare organizations and providers, and he joined BPMC in October 2018 and served as chief counsel and special projects until he was appointed CEO. And we also have Mr. Lawrence Larry Rector, and he serves in various roles in helping FQHCs ensure everyone in their communities maintain access to high quality healthcare. He is the CEO of Dayspring Health effective this year and also serving as CFO and COO. He was the VP of Finance at Cherokee Health Systems and provides consulting for finance and operations and executive leadership through Rector Business Solutions, and he is a certified CPA. So lots of experience from both of our panelists. And so now we will transition to the next slide. And Philip, you can introduce yourself and your organization. And Philip, I think you're on mute.
Pardon me. And thank you, Rachel, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for participating in this discussion. I'm honored and privileged to be invited by PCDC to be among the panel today. So Brooklyn Plaza Medical Center, I'd like to introduce our great organization. It was founded in the 1980s. It was inspired and a lot of hard work was put into launching it by Dr. Josephine English. Dr. Josephine English was the first Black woman OBGYN to have a private practice in New York. She came to our location, our area of Brooklyn, out of concern for the high infant mortality rate of expectant mothers of African American descent. We are located in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. It's a highly densely populated area of Brooklyn. That's where our main facility is located. We offer a wide variety of services from behavioral health to dentistry to women's health to primary care, etc. In addition to our main location, we have a nearby location, a satellite location, providing similar services designed to serve a large cluster of public housing buildings and the families that reside there. And we also have a school-based program serving a public school that exists for the benefit of talented young people who would not otherwise have the means to attend some of our more prestigious schools in New York. So I am I'm pleased to meet you. I'll just conclude by describing our project in summary. Our project involves a new development in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, about 24,000 square feet of space in an area that has been underserved with respect to medical care and attention for decades historically. Unfortunately, our project is part of a larger development. Adjacent to our project is the Bedford Union Armory. The Armory is a structure that was built over 100 years ago and served the military in terms of various exercises during the World Wars, and it had been abandoned for many years. And the city of New York took over the space and signed a lease with a developer to develop this vacant space and turn it into a state-of-the-art recreational and cultural facility for the community that includes basketball courts, ballet school, swimming pool, and we're adjacent to that structure. And we're also adjacent to new affordable housing that was part of the development. So this is a very exciting project for us, and we're looking forward to occupying the new space in the spring of 2025.
Great. Let's move to the next slide so we can introduce. Okay, go ahead, Larry.
Good afternoon. It's also a pleasure for me to be a part of today's session and to be with you all. We are like-hearted in our passion for taking care of the communities we serve. A little bit about Dayspring Health. So if it could be any more opposite from Brooklyn, we are in rural Appalachia or Appalachia, depending on where you are in this country, in the line of Kentucky and Tennessee. We serve about 10,000 patients, which depending on where you live, that might not sound like many, but that's about a third of our community. We offer an array of services. And in the picture there, you see this massive facility. We have recently completed our project, which that was an old Walmart. That is 57,000 square feet that we have renovated to be a regional health center. The need that spurred this idea. So back in 2020, our community's hospital closed. And as you can imagine, without having a community hospital, that creates a lot of gaps that we were desperately trying to fill the gap for, but we didn't have all those services. So there was this dream of how can we bring as much under our roof to take care of our community. Also with that, there's a huge need for just access in general. So our patients typically drive an hour to 2 hours just to see specialists or a certain type of care options. So we've worked to bring that under this roof as well. So it's been very exciting process, but like many of you, almost all of you are somewhere in this journey, and there's a small population that have completed the journey at many stages. It doesn't go away. This fear or consternation of staring at the mountain of, am I ever going to climb this thing? Am I ever going to get on the other side? So looking forward to sharing the tidbits that I can to help you along the process.
Great, thank you both for introducing your projects. I think you've covered some, at least one of the questions I would have wanted to ask you, which is the impetus for your project. It's clear that Brooklyn Plaza needed to move, not only needed, but wanted to expand. And the same thing, there were unmet needs for both of you in your areas. I think it would be helpful if you could also, though, if it is the case, were there tie-ins between the projects as you were developing them and your strategic plans, more specifically, not just a need for a project? Maybe Larry and then Philip, if you both want to respond to that. But
Yeah, I'll be glad to respond. So the quick answer was we did not have in our strategic plan renovate a Walmart. But for a long time, we've known that our site in Williamsburg, which is the name of the town we're in, needed to be enlarged. Like we had outgrown the facility years ago. And when the opportunity for the space came up, then it was, this is our chance. This is the opportunity. And we went as such. So.
Philip, did you have an experience you care to relate?
Yes, thank you, Nancy. So we didn't have a strategic plan. Our project is not the result of a polished deliberative exercise. I was asked to become CEO in March of 2020, right at the onset and the heating up of the pandemic. Our board of directors decided to turn the organization in a different direction and with a different executive administration. And at the time, I had to learn fast and identify the trouble spots within the organization that deserved my immediate attention and prioritization among many other issues that existed at the time. So at the time, I were facing the expiration of the lease at our current location, our main location, that was set to expire in about a year and a half from that time. And at the same time, I inherited, for want of a better way of putting it, a 25-year lease for our new space, which was intended to be a satellite location to supplement our current location. At the time, the previous administration had also invested in a satellite in another neighborhood in Brooklyn. The reason why I mention all of this is because this was not the product of a linear, deliberative, strategic exercise. It was the confluence and consideration of various emergent factors that I needed to act upon immediately. And I recommended to the board of directors that the agency was being spread too thin and that they should abandon that unrelated development because resources would not be there, and then to develop it and to now pivot and consider the Crown Heights space not as a satellite location, but as a relocation for our current facility. So this was the process. It was more of my looking at the state of the organization at the time and trying to consolidate the organization in order to stabilize it financially.
No, that's helpful to know. And even though we would all prefer to have a nice linear, iterative linear process, starting with the strategic plan and the growth from that, it is clear there are sometimes opportunities or necessities that make you go a different way. So appreciate hearing that from both of you. In terms of, I think you also really touched on when you started planning. Clearly, Philip, you began when you started in your role as CEO. I don't know, Larry, if you can add anything to your timeline or discuss your timeline. And I guess for both of you, we will be touching on, just for the audience, we'll be moving into financing and construction aspects and post-construction aspects in this discussion. So I'm not really focusing on the financing as an element in the timeline, but other elements that affected your timeline.
So as I mentioned earlier, a great question, by the way, to kind of put this in frame. For a long time, we've been considering how can we expand our footprint? There's desperately a need for that. So we've had plans that would be able to be modified based on the property that we would have. So it was kind of some frameworks to work with. But when the property became available that we had bought, that was in the fall of 21. So, and then we completed the purchase in spring of 22. And then construction began summer of 23 and completed in early fall of 24.
And Philip, even though you began, thank you, Larry, and even though you began thinking things through, I don't know if there were some key junctures in your timeline that you want to discuss, and if not, we'll move to the next question.
Well, yeah, Nancy, I thank you. I would mention also among the factors that I considered at the time was the fact that our neighborhood was going through, was well in the midst of gentrification, a transition in the neighborhood to a lot of people moving in, a lot of people being priced out. And with the new demographic in the neighborhood, and in being in the midst of major hospital systems here, who were now offering primary care, and not to mention the urgent care facilities, it also became apparent to me that we had reached critical mass in terms of the volume of patients and the volume of visits we could generate to continue to sustain the organization. So that was also a driving force in my recommendation to the board in the decision to relocate from the current facility into the next facility. And really to wrap up my answer, the key junctures necessarily included building the capital to finance this build out. And it was, again, at the time, I inherited a lease that had already been signed for 25 years. We were looking at about an $8.5 or $9 million build out, and the available resources was the promise of a grant for about $3 million or so from One Brooklyn Health System. So the key milestones in the timeline of the project to date were really the points at which we were able to build financing, but through acquiring more grants, and then of course our relationship with PCDC leading into a new market tax credit transaction.
Yeah, so a more phased approach, a phased construction approach more than anything. But for both of you, were there the services you chose to provide clearly were based on unmet needs that you both recognize, but were there specific things either that you chose to add or things that you chose to eliminate along the way, and why?
Larry?
You want me to go first? I'll go first. So one, with the hospital closing, it was recognizing what additional services to add. And the big one would be imaging and radiology. So we designated about 13,000 square feet of the space for CT, X-ray, MRI, ultrasound, DEXA, and eventually mammography. But then in addition to that, we also have space for physical therapy, which we had not had under our roof before. We have a chiropractor in our building. We have a community room with a teaching kitchen because we want to do nutrition. And we have an area for a drive-through pharmacy. And then we expanded our dental, doubled it in square footage because in our area, probably in many of y'all's areas, there's just such a high need for dental. And then brought our primary care over here. We didn't eliminate any services.
That's also a lot of new services to take on, and we should talk on another webinar on how did you prepare yourself for operating those new services, but we're not going to touch on that today. I'm sorry, whet everybody's appetite. Philip, how about you? Were there things that you chose to add or delete from your current constellation of services?
Yeah, Nancy. So we're transferring all the current services we have to the new location as a result of our analysis of the demographics of the new neighborhood and the prevalent medical conditions that exist there, everything from hypertension to diabetes, et cetera. We chose to add ophthalmology and to enhance our support of women's health through sonogram. We had to eliminate certain things that were planned for at the beginning of the project. There had been an intention to have services such as X-ray, MRI, and CAT scan at the new location, but and this lends to how you need to adjust on the fly with these projects. It became apparent that these would be very expensive items to obtain and very expensive items to support in terms of the personnel required for them. And we thought that being in the midst of a major hospital system down the block from SUNY Downstate, these services were already being provided. And we are a primary care facility. We're not an urgent care facility. We're not a hospital facility. So the cost-benefit analysis pointed in the direction of abandoning these services. One other thing I will mention, if I may, is that we had intention to have an in-house pharmacy and also to have an outside party operate our laboratory. And this point would also lend to how you need to pivot along the way during these projects. The space that was built out for these components turned out to be insufficient in terms of satisfying the Department of Health, in terms of certifying them. So a decision had to be made whether to put in an application to amend our certificate of need in order to afford us time to renovate or realign these spaces. And I decided against doing that because that process would have taken very long, would have delayed the project. So instead, we decided to abandon the in-house pharmacy and third-party laboratory for now, get in there, start operating, generate revenues, and then we could go back to the Department of Health in a year or so and revisit these two components.
Yeah, difficult decisions to have to be faced with. And unfortunately, added cost as well,
Right.
to change those, to have to change the architecture of the plans and what the contractor was doing. So, but that's part of where you do have to be flexible along the way and consider the refinements that are necessary. In terms of, I do want to talk about your financing plans, because there are similarities and there are differences. And maybe you could each describe how you ended up with the financing plans you ended up with and your process. Philip, you had a process where you started construction prior to being in a position to close on that new markets financing. Larry, you had not really a similar, everything was lined up, but also a sort of two-phase with the construction financing, if you will, happening sooner. But still, you had different choices of funders you were working with and how much grant funding you also were able to acquire over time. So maybe start with Larry and then Philip.
Gladly. Yeah, so this is one of those questions where I feel like, man, I wish we had 3 hours, but we'll condense it. So one, in our project, I would highly recommend doing something like this because it helped us through the process. Having goals associated with the high level of how you're going to implement it. And ours was what we called the triple aim: affordable, beautiful, and efficient. And that also includes like LEED certification type concepts. So under the affordable umbrella, my mindset was no money left behind, essentially. Like I was going after everything. And that's where, as you all had mentioned earlier in the presentation, reaching out to the experts and the consultants. I talked to so many people, PCDC to be included, on what are the options available out there to leverage into this? And as I learned of options and resources, it was, how do I weave all of these together? Because I don't want to leave anything behind. So in our financing plan, for those that are in process, you'll probably have heard some of these terms. Our project cost was $16 million. So that was the framing. We were able to secure new market tax credits to the 16. We also pursued financing through the USDA because they have lower interest rates. The program that we were able to take advantage of was called Uplift America. So essentially, we locked in a fixed interest rate of 4.4% over 30 years. We also were able to take advantage of the HRSA loan guarantee program, which protects about 80% of the loan balance with a guarantee. And we're also actively looking to rope in a state new market tax credit program piece. So when you're piecing this together, and Nancy, you illustrated well, like things, financing and construction and design work kind of side by side. You don't complete one then move to the next, because you need the plan to secure the financing, and you can't really proceed with the plan without the financing. So they work beside each other. It was quite a process. Really thankful for what we did, but can't emphasize enough. Talk to all the experts, because it's very technical in this process.
Sorry, before turning it to Philip, and timing matters. I mean, sometimes it works in your favor and sometimes it doesn't. Philip, you can comment, I think, on how at first it was a little scary, the timing, and things not gelling all at the same time, maybe quite as well as they did for Dayspring. But let me turn it to you.
Yeah, so the approach was building the airplane in flight for us. The architectural part of the project was already underway, and we were incurring costs for those, and I was paying that out of operations, which was really causing a strain on the organization. And not to mention that in March of 2020, the estimated budget for the project was, again, about $8.5 million. But COVID and post-COVID, materials skyrocketed, et cetera. So we were also facing, that challenge of keeping up with an escalating budget. I couldn't, as Larry just said, you rely on a team and you rely on experts, and that really applied to me as well. I immediately sought to retain a project manager, and was fortunate to retain a very solid project management firm with professionals who were savvy in terms of what grants would be out there and what kind of financing might be available for us. I also hired a CPA as our chief financial officer, and a combination of those two resources, along with myself, we were able to then start looking for and building a stack of financing to fund the project. But it was a strain at the beginning. Again, we only had about a $3 million or so grant, and that was a reimbursement grant. That it wasn't money in the bank. And we started building, we obtained New York City Council grant, a mayor's grant, et cetera, before the point where thankfully PCDC partnered with us and provided us with the initial financing. Although the project was really not quite underway, it couldn't be because we didn't have the money for it. But PCDC's launch funding for us allowed us to get the project rolling.
That's great. Thank you. If you could maybe both describe one or two aspects, which you may have already touched on, so forgive me, but that you think were really key to the successful development of your project? Obviously, Philip, you mentioned the project manager, which is great. That's and the firm, not just the person. But if there are again, other things, one or two things that each of you can point to that really helped, that you would do again and again.
Certainly the triple aim, as I mentioned before, and so I mentioned financing. I'll lean in a little bit more on the beautiful and efficient. So efficient, we wanted the workflows in the design to make sense. So we consulted with providers in the various areas to say, hey, look at this blueprint that an architect that has experience suggested. Would you make any modifications? And numerous examples of ways that we reduced pathways and brought things tighter. But then we also wanted it to be energy efficient, environmentally friendly. So we initially pursued the LEED certification. We saw the price of that, thought, okay, how about we just incorporate the principles? We don't need a piece of paper saying that we did it. So far, we made sure that we had LED lights throughout the building, which are far more efficient. We have the infrastructure built out to install electrical carports for electrical charge stations, and we're still evaluating adding solar panels to the roof. The beautiful, I think everybody will resonate with this. We wanted everyone to walk in the door and say, wow, because when you sense, wow, you know the healthcare is high quality. And that's something that us health centers get a bad rap on is, oh, that's that type of care. That's not high quality. No, we are absolutely high quality. But we've even had some patients that come in and say, I don't feel like I deserve to be here. And it's like, you absolutely deserve to be here. So that was key for us in our work.
That's great. I'm cognizant of the fact that we're running short of time, and I would love to open this up to questions from any of the attendees who would like to pose questions to our panelists. So let me take that moment, see if anybody is interested in posing a question or two. You can either put it in the chat or raise your hand. I think we can see if you raise your hand. All right, well, while we're giving you a chance to formulate your questions, maybe Larry, since you've opened, have your services been in line with what you projected? Or have there been variations maybe by service, especially the newer services? Maybe if you could speak to that and give Philip also a heads up on that, right?
Absolutely. So fortunately, so far, we have exceeded expectations in all areas except for imaging and radiology. So from a financial standpoint, that gives me some peace of mind in the current that, okay, wow, we're actually beating projections. That's really good. Imaging and radiology, for those that do it or wish to do it, and Philip, you explored it. And as soon as you said the cost, I totally resonate with that because I see it now all the time. It is tremendously needed, but it is also very expensive. So when building out projections in that service line, precision is pretty key. And we have not met our expectations, but it's partially because of, in order for us to offer that service, we had to pull in other people. So there's a company called Acumen. They are a national diagnostic company. They brought the equipment, they brought the staff, and then I pay them a monthly fee. I also have to pay a radiologist that I send the reads to. So if any one of those players is, for their own reasons, not able to do the job, it puts us also on hold. So that's been the one that's been the consternation, we'll call it that.
But at least you were able to find the expertise to start it, and whether you change and do a different model over time, it's certainly an option. Again, I don't think we have any questions in the chat, but just wanted to give one more chance for any attendees who would like to pose a question. Okay. I think then, Rachel, you want to take us out? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, everyone's contact information is on here, and we want to thank our panelists for joining us today. I found it very interesting to have this discussion, and so feel free to reach out to anyone. We have contact information here. Thank you for joining us. We will be sending out the recording and the slides. They will also be linked on our website. And I think we'll just stick around for a few more minutes in case anyone has any questions. But thank you again to our panelists for taking the time to join us and share this information. Oh, I do see one hand. Sean, let's see if we can unmute you. Where is the... Don't know. We lost Sean.
Oh. Well,
yeah.
Oh dear.
I think he may have jumped off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we'll maybe Sean will send in a question. So feel free to
Yes.
do that as well. And again, I too would like to thank our panelists for taking the time and really revealing their insights, both of a completed project and a project in progress, serving very, very different neighborhoods and being designed for different reasons based on meeting needs, but also not duplicating services that are available in the communities they serve. So thank you all. Thank you for all of you who joined us for all three sessions. Although it's been exciting to have any of you here who are here for only one. So thank you.
Thank you.